8 police canines from 3 departments, 8 dogs who had spent years on the edge of things. Narcotics sweeps through New Orleans parishes, hostage standoffs in neighborhoods where the air smelled wrong before anything happened, search and rescue operations through Bayou Country where the water moved at night and everything that mattered happened fast. In one afternoon at the Breaux Bridge Emergency Animal Shelter, which was not actually a shelter, but a converted livestock barn 12 miles from anything that still had power, all 8 of them stopped being manageable. They tore through the temporary pen dividers. They bit the air near 3 handlers, who had driven 4 hours through debris-chalked roads to reach them, and the FEMA regional coordinator, a man named Frank Owens, signed the euthanasia authorization at 3 in the afternoon because he had liability forms to file and no better ideas. Nobody in the room argued, because nobody in the room had a better idea. Then Adrienne Locke walked through the south gate, carrying a canvas duffel with a broken zipper pull and a gas station coffee that had gone cold somewhere on the drive from the field hospital, and before she reached the barn door, 2 of the dogs had stopped barking. Not because someone sedated them, not because someone gave a command, they just stopped. The kind of stopping that makes experienced handlers look at each other. If you stay with this until the very end, and I want you to stay, drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this one travels. The storm had made landfall 4 days earlier. By the time it was done, 3 parishes were underwater, and the Iberville Parish Police Department, the St. Martin Sheriff's K-9 unit, and a task force team out of Baton Rouge had all needed to evacuate their working dogs under emergency protocol. That meant loading 8 animals into transport crates in the middle of a night that smelled like diesel and standing water, driving in convoy through 2 road closures, and depositing them at the Breaux Bridge barn because it was the only facility within 60 miles that had a working generator and enough square footage to hold 8 large dogs. What it did not have was adequate staffing, adequate enclosures, or anyone with meaningful experience in the specific behavioral needs of traumatized working dogs. What it had was Corporal Jade Sellers, 22 years old, 8 months into her first handler assignment with Iberville Parish, who had been left behind to manage the dogs because her sergeant had needed to go back into the flood zone and she was the one who'd volunteered. Sellers was good at her job in the ordinary sense. She was not prepared for this. The dogs had been in crisis for 36 hours by the time Owens signed the authorization. Ghost, a 9-year-old German Shepherd who'd lost most of his hearing in a flashbang incident 3 years earlier, had been throwing himself against the plywood dividers with enough force that the structure was visibly bowing. Havoc, a 7-year-old Malinois with a narcotics detection record spanning 400 confirmed fines, was doing tight, frantic circles in a space too small for tight, frantic circles, and the sound he made was not barking, but something lower and more sustained that sat in the chest of everyone who heard it. Talon, Briar, Silo, Delta, Storm, Remy. 6 more. Each of them decorated, each of them trained to function in environments that would break most living things, all of them now functioning at the absolute bottom of their capacity, because they'd been separated from their handlers, transported through a catastrophe, and placed in a strange enclosed space with strange smells and no predictable schedule, and no one who knew the specific language each of them spoke. Remy was the worst, and not in the way the others were worst. The others were loud. Remy was a 7-year-old Belgian Malinois who had spent 5 years working narcotics interdiction on I-10, and whose handler, Officer Darren Beaumont, had not made it out of the Atchafalaya Basin when the levee gave. The notification had come through the shelter radio at 0600 on day 2. Sellers had heard it and then gone to stand outside the barn for 15 minutes because she was 22 and she was doing the best she could, and she needed those 15 minutes before she could go back in and do her job. Remy hadn't eaten since day 1. He sat in the back corner of the pen they'd assigned him, not responding, not vocalizing, not moving unless someone came within 3 feet, at which point he retreated further and pressed himself flat against the wall. Dr. Faye Aldrich, the vet contracted to the shelter, had been writing notes in the margin of her clipboard for 2 days. Failure to thrive, unresponsive to behavioral intervention, candidacy for humane euthanasia. She hadn't filed the recommendation yet. She kept finding reasons to wait one more hour. Frank Owens had no such ambivalence. Owens was 53 years old, ran regional FEMA shelter operations out of Baton Rouge, and had spent his career managing logistics in ways that did not include extended observation of the emotional state of canine units. He looked at the liability exposure: 8 unmanageable dogs, 3 handlers with minor bite injuries, a facility not rated for working dog housing, and he made the decision he was trained to make. He filed the paperwork. He called it responsible. Sellers was standing outside the barn door at 2:45, trying to figure out how to object in terms that a logistics administrator would find credible, when she saw the woman coming across the gravel lot from the road. She looked ordinary. That was the first thing Sellers noticed. The woman was maybe 30, wearing green scrubs under a fleece jacket with a worn Red Cross patch on the shoulder, carrying a canvas duffel on one arm and a Circle K coffee cup in the other hand. Medium height, dark hair pulled into a low knot that suggested practicality rather than style. She walked at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, but had something in it that Sellers couldn't immediately name. A quality of certainty that had nothing to do with speed. "Is this the animal shelter?" the woman said. "Temporary," Sellers said. "Are you with the Red Cross team?" "I'm covering a field hospital 12 miles east. Ear support." She looked at the barn door, from which the sound of 8 stressed dogs was clearly audible. "I heard about the situation from one of the paramedics on the convoy. I've worked with canine units before. I thought I might be able to help." Sellers was 22 years old and had been awake for 31 hours and had just read an euthanasia authorization with 8 names on it. She looked at the woman for a long moment. "What's your name?" Sellers said. "Locke," the woman said. "Adrienne Locke." Sellers opened the barn door. Sergeant Troy Bancroft arrived at the Bro Bridge shelter at 4:15, driving a department truck with a cracked windshield and 3 inches of mud on the undercarriage from 2 days in the field. Bancroft ran K-9 operations for the Baton Rouge Task Force and had been boots down in the evacuation zone since the storm hit, and he had been trying to reach his unit's dogs for 36 hours through a phone system that kept dropping calls. He was 46 years old, broad through the shoulders, in the way of men who have been doing physical work for 20 years, and he had the face of someone who had been told many things he didn't want to hear and had developed a resting expression that indicated he was prepared to hear more. He came through the barn door expecting chaos and found something he didn't expect. The barn was not quiet. The dogs were still vocalizing in that low continuous register that experienced handlers recognized as sustained distress, but it was different from what he'd been told to expect on the drive down. Lower. Like someone had turned a dial from 11 to 7. In the middle pen, a woman he didn't recognize was sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor 18 inches from Ghost's enclosure. The old German shepherd was on the other side, lying down, head up, watching her. His whole body had the quality of something that had been braced for a long time and was now, incrementally, releasing. Bancroft watched this for 4 seconds. "Who's that?" he said to Sellers, who had appeared at his elbow. "Locke. Adrienne Locke. She's from the field hospital down the road." "What's her background with K-9? "She said field experience. She came in 2 hours ago, and she's been working through them one by one." Sellers paused. "Ghost has been trying to go through the wall all morning. He's been lying down for 40 minutes. Bancroft walked toward the pen. The woman didn't look up when he approached. "Sergeant Bancroft," he said. He didn't put warmth in it. He didn't put hostility in it either. It was the voice of a man who needed information and was going to get it efficiently. "What's your background with working dogs?" "Some field experience," Locke said without looking up. Her attention stayed on Ghost. She was making no sound, no movement, just sitting at a precise and particular distance from the mesh. "I'd rather show you than explain it right now." "That's not an answer." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." Now she looked at him. Her eyes were dark and steady and not unfriendly. "If you'd like me to stop what I'm doing and explain it, I will. But I'd rather wait until his color's better." Bancroft looked at Ghost. The dog's gums, visible when he panted, were not the gray-white they'd reportedly been 2 hours ago. They were pink. He was still stressed, but he was not in the place he'd been. Bancroft sat down on a hay bale and waited. Frank Owens arrived at 4:30, and he arrived the way administrators arrive when they have made a decision and expect it to have been implemented. He found Locke in the second pen, sitting at the same measured distance from Havoc's enclosure. Havoc had stopped circling. He was standing, hackles not fully down but not at full extension, his nose working the air. He was reading her the way dogs read things they haven't decided about yet. "Who authorized this civilian's access?" Owens said. "I did," Sellers said. She said it with the particular steadiness of someone who has decided to own a decision. Owens's expression did the thing it did when he encountered inconvenience with human faces. "She's not credentialed for this facility. She's not on any staff manifest. I want her escorted out." Locke looked up. Her face was calm, not apologetic, not aggressive, just present. "3 of these dogs haven't eaten in over 36 hours, she said. 2 of them have pressure wounds from throwing themselves against the enclosures. Remy in Pen 7 has been in behavioral shutdown since yesterday morning, and he's going to need intervention within the next 12 hours, or you're going to lose him to physical decline, not behavioral crisis." She paused. "If you remove me now, you're going to have a significantly harder afternoon than you're currently having." "I am going to have a significantly harder afternoon," Owens said, "if I allow an uncredentialed civilian to continue operating in a facility where there are active liability concerns." Bancroft spoke from the hay bale. His voice was even. "She's right about Remy. I've been getting updates by radio since yesterday. The vet's notes say the same thing." "I didn't ask for your input, Sergeant." "I know," Bancroft said. "I'm giving it." The air in the barn got tight. Owens turned back to Locke. "Gather your things." She stood unhurried, without drama, shouldered her duffel, and walked toward the south gate. Bancroft watched her go. He was aware of a feeling he recognized from enough situations to name. The specific weight of watching someone leave a room and not being certain the room was better for it. She was 50 yards down the gravel road when his radio crackled. It was Sellers, her voice careful and controlled in the way of someone managing something serious. "Sergeant, Havoc is out." Repeat, "Havoc is out of the enclosure." Havoc was a 7-year-old Malinois who had spent 3 years working active narcotics interdiction in environments where every unfamiliar thing was a potential threat. His retirement protocol had not yet been finalized because he was not retired. He was evacuated, which his nervous system read as operational and in crisis, and when Havoc read crisis, he moved toward it. He was out. He was in the center of the barn. 2 handlers were against the far wall doing everything correctly. No eye contact, no sudden movement, bodies turned slightly sideways, and none of it was working because Havoc was not reading the situation as training. He was reading it as real. Bancroft hit the barn door at a run and came in to find Havoc at full hackle, doing the low barrel-chested thing that meant the situation had about 10 seconds before it resolved itself badly. He reached for his radio. Behind him, the barn door opened. He knew who it was before he turned. Locke came through the door at the same pace she'd used, crossing the gravel lot. Not slow, not fast, something in between with that quality he still hadn't found the right word for. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't crouch. She didn't do any of the things shelter training videos teach. She walked directly into Havoc's space and put herself between him and the handlers against the wall. And she let him look at her. Havoc's hackles stayed up. His head was low. He was doing the assessment that working dogs do, reading every variable simultaneously, and what he was getting from her was something that didn't fit his threat model because it wasn't in there. She was not afraid. She was not aggressive. She was not braced, not performing calm, not doing anything a person does when they are pretending to be calm. She just was. 8 seconds passed, Bancroft counted. She said one word, not a command. Something lower than a command, in a register that Bancroft wasn't entirely sure he'd heard correctly. She said, "Easy." Havoc's hackles dropped halfway. She took one step forward. They dropped the rest of the way. He sat. It was not the mechanical sit of a trained response to a known cue. It was the sit of an animal that has made a decision about a person, his whole body reorganized around that decision. He looked at her with an expression Bancroft had seen on working dogs exactly twice in 20 years, and both times it had been directed at someone the dog had worked alongside for a long time. The barn was completely silent. Bancroft turned off his radio. He found her 20 minutes later, after Havoc was secured and Aldrich was doing checks, sitting on the concrete step outside the barn entrance with her cold coffee held in both hands. He sat down beside her. "What you did in there," he said. "Yeah. That's not something they teach in field hospital training." "No. And it's not something you pick up on Red Cross deployments." "No." She looked at the gravel lot, at the tree line, at nothing particular. "You were law enforcement," he said. It was not a question. She was quiet for a moment. "I was adjacent to law enforcement." "What does that mean?" "Some things I can talk about, some things I can't." He looked at the side of her face. 20 years in law enforcement had given him a specific skill set for reading people who were telling true things in careful ways, and he was using it now. "When did you last work with K9 units?" 7 years ago, give or take." "In what capacity?" A pause. "Behavioral medicine, in contexts that don't have a lot of documentation." Bancroft had spent 20 years around people who said things like contexts that don't have a lot of documentation. He knew the shape of that sentence. He'd used it himself. "Owens pulled your access," he said, "formally this time." "I know." He called the Red Cross regional coordinator. "They're reviewing your temporary affiliation." She nodded, not surprised. "Those dogs," he said, and his voice had something in it now, sitting at the edge of his professional register. "They haven't responded to anyone in 36 hours, not to me, not to Sellers, not to Aldrich. Havoc broke containment twice before you arrived. It took 4 people and a catch pole to get him secured, and someone got a forearm bruise they are not documenting because they're afraid of the liability report." He stopped. "You walked in and you changed it in 2 hours." She looked down at her coffee cup. "I didn't change it, I started it." These dogs need weeks of consistent work, the right approach with each one, individually. A routine that doesn't reinforce the hypervigilance. She paused. "The fix is what happens after I'm gone." "After I'm gone." Bancroft looked at her. She was already standing. She was halfway across the gravel when his radio crackled, and the voice on the other end was Sellers's, and it did not have the composure Sellers had been maintaining for 2 days. "Sergeant, you need to come back inside. It's Remy." Remy was a 7-year-old Belgian Malinois who had not eaten in 4 days and had not allowed voluntary contact from any human being since the radio notification about Beaumont had come through. He didn't attack. He retreated. He pressed himself into the back corner of Pen 7, and he stayed there, existing at the minimum capacity of an animal that is waiting for something it does not understand will not come back. Aldrich had been building the humane euthanasia case not because Remy was dangerous, but because watching a dog wait to stop was its own kind of cruelty, and she was out of other options. Bancroft came through the barn door and stopped. Remy was not in his corner. He was in the center of his pen, standing, and Locke was on the other side of the mesh, on her knees on the concrete, one hand flat against the wire. Remy had his nose pressed against her palm. Bancroft had not seen that dog make voluntary contact with anyone in 4 days. He stood in the doorway and did not move. Sellers appeared at his elbow. She was 22 years old and had clearly been crying, which she was clearly hoping he wouldn't notice. "She was leaving," Sellers said, barely above a whisper. "She was all the way to the road, and then she just turned around and came back in and went straight to his pen. Like she knew." "Like she knew," Bancroft repeated. His radio crackled. Owens's coordinator, notifying him that Locke's access to the facility had been formally revoked, and she was to be escorted out immediately. Bancroft looked at his watch. He put the radio back on his belt without responding. He had 17 minutes. He spent the first 4 doing something he almost never did. Nothing. Standing in the barn doorway, watching Remy's nose against Locke's palm, turning the morning over in his mind. Then he called a contact. The contact ran records for the state attorney general's office and owed him a favor from a case 2 years ago involving falsified narcotics inventory, and she was the kind of person who could find things quickly and ask questions afterward. What she found, 20 minutes later, was mostly consistent with what Locke had told him, with 2 exceptions. The service record was real. Army, Medical Corps, separation date 8 years ago. The deployment records were there, but they weren't missing. They were redacted, sealed with a classification code she'd only seen on files touched by a specific tier of federal operation, the kind that existed in the space between official policy and operational necessity. The second thing was a commendation citation from a Joint Task Force designation that, when she ran the unit code, returned no results from any active federal agency database. The unit didn't officially exist. Bancroft stood outside the barn for a while, turning the information over. A civilian Red Cross volunteer with a classified service record, a commendation from a unit with no official existence, and a skill set that had moved 8 traumatized working dogs from crisis toward something functional in under 3 hours. He went to find Owens. The conversation in the barn office was not dramatic. It had the quality of 2 men who each understood exactly where their authority ended and were deciding simultaneously whether to respect that or not. "She's on federal property," Owens said. "Her access has been revoked. If you don't escort her out, I will have security do it." "There's a dog in Pen 7, Bancroft said, that the vet has been filing euthanasia paperwork on for 2 days because he stopped eating after his handler died in the flooding. She's the first contact he's accepted in 96 hours. He paused. "If you interrupt that right now, you're writing a second set of paperwork." Owens's expression did something complicated. "That is not my concern. The regional K-9 welfare coordinator is going to be here tomorrow," Bancroft said. "I called her this morning. She's going to want to know what happened to the dogs in this facility and what decisions were made and by whom." He kept his voice level, the voice of a man who was not picking a fight. "I'd suggest we make sure the record is complete." Owens looked at him for a long moment. 4 minutes, he said. Locke was already standing when Bancroft came back. Remy was at the mesh, not pressed against it, but at it, watching her prepare to leave with an attention that Bancroft found unexpectedly hard to observe. Sellers was nearby, not looking at anything in particular. "Same approach every time," Locke said to Sellers, without turning. "Don't reach first. Don't adjust the schedule when he seems better, especially not when he seems better. He's going to test it. He's going to have bad days, and you're going to wonder if you're doing something wrong." She paused. "You're not. You're just doing it slowly, which is the only way it actually works." Sellers wrote something on the clipboard. She wasn't actually reading. "What if he goes back to the corner?" Sellers said. "Then he goes back to the corner. You sit outside the pen and you don't ask anything from him. That's not failure. That's trust building." Sellers nodded once. "Quick, the way you nod when you need it not to count as the emotional response it is." Bancroft walked Locke out through the barn entrance, past Owens, who said nothing but tracked her with the attention of a man who was not finished with the situation. At the gravel lot, she stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for the time. I was buying time for the dogs." "Sure," she said, and there was something in her face that wasn't quite amusement. "That's definitely why." She walked toward the road. He watched her go. The afternoon light was flat and gray, the kind that came with cloud cover after a major storm, the air still carrying the particular smell of standing water and displaced earth. She walked the way she'd walked across the gravel 4 hours ago. That pace. That quality he still hadn't found the right word for. At the gate, she raised one hand without turning. He raised his. The regional K-9 welfare coordinator arrived the next morning. Her name was Lieutenant Commander Priya Ose, a name Bancroft recognized because her office had issued the Working Animal Welfare Protocol update 3 years ago that nobody at the state level had actually implemented, and she did not look like someone who had driven 4 hours through storm debris to receive a pleasant briefing. She was not receiving one. The document package Bancroft had built overnight ran 27 pages, welfare protocol violations across 38 days, 3 handler injuries not escalated, The euthanasia authorization signed without veterinary consultation, in violation of the multi-agency working animal welfare agreement that Owens had himself signed in 2021. The behavioral contract that Owens had suspended 2 months ago to save $11,000 from a budget line he described in the memo as non-essential support services. $11,000. OC read the timeline of Remy's decline with an expression that got progressively flatter. Bancroft understood this as a woman who was professionally furious and was managing it the way her rank required. "Who authorized the contract suspension?" she said. "Owens. The memo is in Section 3. She turned to Section 3. While she read, 2 things happened simultaneously. Remy, in Pen 7, ate for the first time in 5 days. Sellers documented it in the log in careful clinical language that failed entirely to conceal that she was also quietly crying and had decided that was acceptable. Half a bowl of food eaten slowly in the direction of the fence, as if eating towards something. And outside the south gate, an unmarked government vehicle parked in the gravel lot and 2 people got out. One wore a DEA field jacket. The other was in civilian clothes, mid-50s, carrying a clearance badge that the shelter's credential scanner returned as a code instead of a name. Sellers brought this to Bancroft's attention because nobody on staff knew what to do with it. Bancroft recognized the shape of that immediately. He texted Locke. She arrived in 8 minutes. The meeting in the barn office was not planned. It had the quality of things that happen when multiple forces converge on the same point from different directions, and nobody is fully in control of the resulting geometry. The man in civilian clothes was named Director Alan Foss from the Office of Special Investigations, a designation that existed in the space between federal agencies and operated, as Bancroft now understood with a precision he hadn't had 2 days ago, in exactly the kind of contexts that didn't have a lot of documentation. He had come because Bancroft's welfare report had named Locke, and Locke's name in a formal document attached to a regional law enforcement inquiry was the kind of thing that surfaced in systems she was still connected to, systems that were still watching. She sat across the table from Fossey with the controlled distance she'd been carrying since Bancroft first saw her, but underneath it he caught something else now. Something that had history in it. 7 years, Foss said, not an accusation, a fact stated for the record. 6.5, Locke said. "I need to understand what happened here," Foss said, "not for the welfare inquiry, because your name is now in a formal document that is going to be reviewed, and when it's reviewed, people are going to ask about your background, and your background has a classification code that requires an explanation I cannot give on the public record." Locke looked at the table, then at Bancroft, then at Foss. 8 dogs, she said. Her voice was even. Combat veterans in active crisis because a facilities administrator cut their behavioral health contract to save $11,000. One of them was going to die today, not from aggression, from grief. She paused. That's what happened. That's all of it. Fossey held her gaze for a long moment. That's not quite all of it. Everything else, she said, was before today. And you know everything that was before today. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Bancroft counted. OC set her pen down. "I'm going to need the full behavioral incident record from the date the contract was suspended," she said to Bancroft. "Everything. And I'm going to need someone to explain to me why a documented welfare violation pattern spanning 38 days did not trigger the emergency protocol that this facility's own operating agreement requires." She said this to Bancroft, but in a way that meant the room. Owens arrived at 2 in the afternoon with the air of a man who had come to deliver news and found the room occupied by people he hadn't expected. He looked at OC's credentials. He looked at Fossey's badge, which the scanner still couldn't read, and he looked at Locke, who regarded him with the expression she'd been carrying all day, the carefully neutral one, the one that had nothing left to apologize for. "Mrs. Locke," Owens said, "you are not authorized to be in this facility. She's operating under a temporary consultation status," OC said, not looking up from the document she was reading. "Issued this morning through the Regional Welfare Protocol Office. Sit down, Director." Owens sat. What followed was procedural in the way that significant things are when the real weight is underneath the language. OC reviewed the incident timeline. She reviewed the euthanasia authorization, signed without veterinary consultation. She reviewed the budget memo suspending the behavioral contract and noted, with the flat precision of someone who had found something she was going to pursue, that the contract had been suspended 2 months before the storm. The welfare deficit predated the emergency. It could not be attributed to it. The pattern that emerged from the documentation was not the pattern of a man responding badly to a crisis. It was the pattern of a man who had been making administrative decisions that prioritized liability reduction over animal welfare in consistent, documented, ignored ways for most of a year. Foss asked 4 questions, all precise. Locke answered 2, the other 2 she declined, and Foss did not push. Owens's legal advisor was called at 3. By 4, Owens had been placed on administrative leave pending formal review. At 4:15, Aldrich came to find Bancroft. Her face had a quality he hadn't seen on it in 3 days. Not relief, exactly. Something that sat near relief and was moving toward it. "Remy," she said, "he's at the fence." There was a man named Amos Pryor who had been given a cot in the maintenance shed behind the barn because the town shelter was full and he had nowhere to go. He was 51 years old, a former Army infantryman who had done 3 tours and come back with things that didn't fit in the life he'd had before, and had spent the last 2 years moving between temporary housing and the kind of not quite. Anywhere that veterans fall into when the systems meant to catch them are too slow or too small or too full of paperwork. He had been sitting near the south fence of the animal barn since the morning of day 2, not asking anything, not causing any trouble. Just sitting in a camp chair with a cup of coffee and his eyes on the chain link. Nobody had asked him to leave because nobody had noticed him specifically. He was the kind of person who had learned, over years, to occupy space without demanding it. Locke had noticed him on her first day. She'd noticed because Talon, a 6-year-old Malinois in the pen nearest the south wall, had been facing the fence for most of the afternoon. Not in distress. Facing it with something that looked like attention, like recognition of a specific quality that the dog's body understood before anything else did. She had walked to the fence and looked through it at Pryor, and he had looked back. "How long have you been sitting there?" she'd said. "Since yesterday morning," he said. He had the unhurried voice of someone who had made peace with not being in a hurry. "He knows you're there," she said, meaning Talon. Pryor looked at the dog. "I wasn't trying to bother anyone." "You're not." She had looked at Pryor for a moment with the direct, assessing quality she used for things she needed to understand accurately. "Have you been around working dogs?" "Had a dog in the service. Mine detection. Named Korsman because he kept bringing things to people. A pause. Different kind of dog." "Same," she said, "in the ways that matter." She had told Sellers to let Pryor sit with Talon's pen on the daily schedule. Sellers had done it without asking why, which Bancroft filed as a mark in Sellers's favor. By day 3, Talon was taking food from Pryor's hand through the fence gap. On the afternoon of day 5, Locke brought Pryor to Remy's pen. Bancroft watched from the doorway. Pryor sat down on the concrete floor outside the enclosure with the easy, patient quality of someone who had nothing pressing and understood that time was not the enemy. He didn't reach. He didn't speak. He just sat. Remy watched him from the center of the pen for a long time. Then he took one step forward, then another. He pressed his nose against the mesh near Pryor's knee. "Hey," Pryor said quiet. "Hey, buddy." Bancroft left them to it. The formal findings from OC's review were issued 6 days later. The welfare violations were documented in full. 38 days. 4 ignored behavioral intervention requests from Aldrich. 3 handler injuries not escalated. A contract suspension executed without veterinary consultation in violation of the multi-agency agreement. The euthanasia authorization, signed without the required veterinary sign-off, was flagged separately as a protocol failure of a different category. Owens's administrative review found what the document trail had been suggesting for most of a week: a pattern of decisions that prioritized liability management over welfare compliance, executed consistently enough over enough time that calling them individual errors was no longer accurate. The $11,000 contract was reinstated at full value. The behavioral health specialist who had held it, Dr. Constance Weil, 23 years of working animal rehabilitation experience, was brought back in week 2. She arrived, reviewed the individual behavioral notes Locke had written for each dog in a worn spiral notebook, and told Bancroft it was the most precise working animal field assessment she had seen outside a clinical setting. "Who wrote this?" she said. "The temporary Red Cross volunteer," Bancroft said. Well looked at him. "She's not a volunteer." "No," he agreed, among other things. Fosse's process, running parallel and separate, resolved Locke's classification situation with a speed that told Bancroft it had been in motion before the Bro Bridge shelter came onto anyone's radar. Her service record, 12 years, not the 6.5 that the official timeline had suggested, 12 years across 2 program designations under a task force formally disbanded 7 years ago, was declassified at the appropriate level for formal recognition. The commendations that had been sealed were entered into the record. The names of the people she'd worked with, the ones who didn't have official records, the ones whose families had not been notified because the program that employed them officially didn't exist. Those names went in too. Locke was not in the room when Fosse told Bancroft about it. She was in the barn with Remy, sitting with the specific patience of someone who understood that the thing she was waiting for would happen on its own schedule, not hers. Bancroft went to find her. She was on the floor outside Pen 7, back against the concrete wall, the worn notebook on her knee. Remy was lying on his side with his head toward the mesh 3 inches from her hand. He was breathing in the long, slow rhythm of an animal that has decided provisionally to set something down. "The recognition came through," Bancroft said. She looked up. Her face did something honest and fast, something that didn't stay on the surface long enough to name. "All of it," she said. 12 years, your name on the record, all of it." She looked at her hand near the mesh, at Remy's slow breathing, at the particular quality of the barn light in late afternoon, which was warm and steady and had nothing wrong with it. "How does that feel?" Bancroft said. She was quiet for a moment. "Strange," she said. "I stopped expecting it a long time ago. When you stop expecting something long enough, you restructure around the absence." She paused. "It's good. I just need to figure out what it means for what comes next." "What do you want it to mean?" She looked at Remy. "Something real," she said. "Something visible. Using what I know in a place where it can be documented." A pause. "There's no standardized training for individual behavioral assessment in working dog recovery programs. No formal curriculum. Every facility is making it up from scratch because nobody has built the framework yet." "I know," Bancroft said. "I've been saying that for 3 years." She looked at him. "Who would build it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Someone with medical and behavioral background. Someone who'd worked K9 in field conditions and understood what those dogs carry when they come back." He nodded toward her notebook. "Someone whose assessment notes already constitute the foundation of what that framework would look like." "Is that an offer?" "It's an observation," he said, "that I have a formal proposal going to OC's office for a program development consultant position, and that the position description is specific enough to narrow the eligible candidate pool to approximately 1 person. She looked at Remy, then at the notebook, then at Bancroft. "You wrote it around me," she said. "I wrote it accurately." She shook her head slowly, and something moved across her face that was almost a smile, and this time she let it be visible. "I'll think about it." "I know you will." Amos Pryor was offered the role of primary volunteer handler for Remy's recovery, pending formal assessment. He accepted it with the same unhurried quality he had brought to the camp chair and the fence and the hours of sitting outside a pen without asking anything from the dog on the other side. Aldrich documented the match in the behavioral log and added a note about the mechanism of it. 2 systems shaped by the same kind of loss, finding in each other the particular predictability that made it possible to begin again. Sellers ran the morning protocol with Talon every day at the same time, same approach, no adjustments even when it seemed like they weren't needed. She texted Locke updates on day 8. Locke sent back 2 words, "Keep going." Ghost in Pen 3 ate his breakfast in under 5 minutes on day 9. Aldrich documented that one in the log with the clinical precision of someone who was also quietly very pleased. On a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after the storm, Locke came back to Bro Bridge to start her first official day as Program Development Consultant. Credentials intact, position fully authorized, her name on the Facility Access Register in permanent ink. Bancroft was at the barn door. "You came back," he said. "I said approximately 3 weeks. She stopped. She looked at him with the direct reading look she had, the one that didn't perform anything. "Bancroft, what you did, the document package, calling Osei, standing in that office when you didn't have to. The dogs needed." "I'm not talking about the dogs," she said. "I mean," she stopped, restructured the way she did when the imprecise version wasn't good enough. "You stayed in the room when it would have been easier not to." Bancroft held her gaze. "So did you." She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once and went inside. In Pen 7, Remy was at the fence before she reached it. His ears were forward. His tail was moving. She put her hand to the mesh, and he pressed his nose against her knuckles, and the morning was cold and clear and bright, and the work ahead was long and specific and real, and nothing about it was perfect, and all of it was exactly enough.